So, who built the modern British railway system? I guess you can tell by the question asked that it wasn't necessarily the British, and indeed it's not. When you look back into history, I was, a side note here, I was looking at my family history, and I saw in my Irish heritage that I had some Navvies that were in there. And then also I saw some in my English heritage and Welsh heritage. And I thought, well, these were people that were in the Navy. They were ship goers, and eventually that got us across here to America, not too much farther than this, and in the Industrial Revolution. So it must have all been part of it, and kind of left it at that until later I found out that navvies aren't actually the Navy. I found out whenever I saw an article that said the Irish. I was looking up pirates, and I found a story on the Irish and how the Irish um, had a altercation or a fight with the English navies, and I was like, oh, okay, so here's like the British Navy and the Irish Navy getting into a fight, and indeed it was a landlocked battle at a pub over this navy situation, and so I found out then that navvies really is a slang and kind of a British cheeky form of the idea of navigational engineer. And that's an odd title, but it really is woodwrights and wood masons, if you will, along with ironsmiths who are incredible at their job, and people that know how to build roads. And they had also taken all the people from Ireland that were shipbuilders and the bigger people, and utilized them in a way to help build these places. So let's look into this, and it will be spoken in somewhat of a political correctness, with a little bit of kid gloves on, if you will. Now, the Great Famine had a range of negative effects on Ireland: starvation, disease, economic turmoil, and notably a period of mass immigration, if you want to call it that. Although some of those who were forced to leave Ireland came to the United States in slavery and were the first United States slaves, a large number also went to mainland Britain, where they labored to construct the first mass railway system network in the world. And no, they weren't necessarily slaves. They were paid and fed quite well. They were paid in meat and beer constantly and so on. Anyhow, of the 250,000 navigators or navvies in the U.S., it's navigational engineers, operating in Britain at the height of the railway expansion, roughly 1 in 3 was an Irishman. I read stories where it was about 40%, and then whenever there was a somewhat of a strike of a large group of the British ones trying to get certain things for themselves, the Irish kept working, and they were the large component of it for a short while, and this even caused some problems, and people got back to work. In fact, it was kind of a strike buster, and the English didn't like the fact that they had kept working and stuff, that they were supposed to strike too, and there were fights of the fact that, we didn't have a problem. We had already come to terms with our agreement, and we're just trying to get through with the building of the place. But let's not go to too much conjecture here. The life of a navvy was tough. In return for a very high production target, in other words, get that road done, get that railway system done, the navvies could expect a moderate pay packet, which would normally exceed the wages received by their compatriots in the factories or in other lines of employment. Now, this is a long speech way of saying that they got paid pretty good, but not good enough for what the work that they were putting out and having to go. But it also was more in wages than the common person would receive working in markets, working in factories and stuff, and doing menial labor jobs. The conditions in which the navvies lived and worked were often basic and normally dangerous. Many navvies ended up living in navvy cottages are wooden shacks close to the stretch of railway line that they were building, moving as the work progressed onto other areas of the country. And indeed, some of these areas that they had built up little shanty towns in ended up being depots later, and in fact spurned many of the smaller towns, that some of which got large factories in, and turned into larger towns in Britain itself. A few of well note, but if you look into the history of it all, unsafe working environments were common. Explosives like dynamite were frequently used with barely a nod to health and safety considerations. In blasting out the Woodhead tunnels, the largest railway tunnel in the world when it was finished, at 3 miles long, the navvies used a close to 150 tons of gunpowder to blow out troublesome spots of rock, and a great number were maimed or killed. Where a career-ending injury befell a navvy, it would not be compensated for. It would not be compensated for, and the widow of a navvy killed in the line of work could not expect any financial support from her husband's employers. Partly for this reason, but perhaps mostly because of being far from home, like people in the service, with money in their pockets, the navvies garnered a hard drinking, hard fighting reputation, living as if each day was their last and causing a ruckus wherever they went. And indeed, that is kind of what follows servicemen. You can see servicemen too. They'll all pull together if anybody comes against them. But then again, the Marines are always getting in a fight with the Navy guy and getting in fights with the Army guys at every basis they have there, and sticking up for each other. And then, of course, that shows a unity of that. And then they all get together. And if anybody starts shit with them from an outsider, they'll all pound him. So it's kind of a strange thing, but the discrimination of that Irish navies received from their English counterparts also sometimes spilt over into outright brawling. This gives us some interesting contemporary newspaper coverage as various clashes between Irish and English navies made the news. One incident was sparked by a 16-gallon drum of beer, so it's like a keg of beer, and another coming about as a result of Irish drinking in a pub that was reserved for English navvies. And so, you ain't from around here, boy, are you? And things broke out. And of course, here we are sticking up for each other. And enough Irish were there that it turned into something and wasn't allowed to be overpowered, but then caused a problem. The Irish navvies themselves were rarely the cause of the trouble, though. The main issue was that the English thought that the Irish were a threat to their pay and conditions by working longer hours for less pay, or by working while the other nationalities were striking. It's a common accusations leveled at immigrant workforces. So I encourage you to look into these navvies and how they had built basically the railway system and many of the roads, and started off some of the towns that encompass part of Britain, and what they meant to there. Another reflection you can see of that is these same people going to America and eventually building its railway system, building some of its infrastructure, all the time being discriminated. Now, fight between the navvies on Tuesday at Barnsley Telegram says an amount of ill feeling which has existed. I want you to notice the propaganda that's built into these. Even back here, you can see how news tries to, go one way or the other, and it definitely leans. It sure as hell aren't standing on two legs in most cases. On Tuesday, a Barnsley Telegram says an amount of ill feeling which had existed between English and Irish navvies on the new Hull and Barnsley Railway reached a crisis. Two sections came into collision, so that's where the two sections of track met, when the English proved victorious and drove the Irish navvies employed near Brierley right off the works, using several very roughly. Now, using several very roughly is beating people near to death, okay? And The odd thing here is that they're both employed by the same employer and were paid to make this meat. But as you can tell, when they met up, it didn't go so well. The Irish laborers left the works and did not return yesterday morning. Recent Irish affairs, it is believed, gave rise to the outbreak. You can see kind of propaganda that's built even into things that's like that. I wanted to kind of point that one out to you. Many of those with Navvy ancestors still do not realize that they are related to these remarkable men. Designers may have mapped the routes and engineers built the stock that would travel on them, but these Irishmen had a large hand in blasting the routes for the tunnels, building the embankments and viaducts, and making the designs reality using nothing more than brute strength and some explosives. The Irishmen were a key part in the building of modern Britain. Like, share, and subscribe, guys. Enjoy.